Hey friends, welcome to week 2 of Your Own Image. We are diving right into our first art journal page, and I'm going to start by putting down a layer of acrylic paint. I really like using craft acrylic in my art journal because it dries matte, and that means that my pages don't stick together, and the bonus to using craft acrylic is that it is super cheap. So if you've never used acrylic before, please don't go out and buy the expensive kind. Just stick with those little 2-ounce bottles that you can get for as cheap as 50 cents a pop. I'm using an old gift card to scrape my paint across the page and get a nice thin layer. Craft acrylic already dries pretty quickly, but scraping it across the page instead of using brushes also expedites the drying process. Next, I'm going to fill in the edges using a plain old cosmetics wedge that you could get at a dollar store. This also applies the paint very thinly, and when you are working onto a blank page, you can get some nice blending effects with the acrylic paint using the cosmetics wedge. I'm using 2 very similar colors of dark blue for this page. You could use any 2 colors for your background. I've chosen dark blue because it tends to go with just about everything. If you do use 2 very different colors, try to keep them analogous, which is close to each other on the color wheel. That way, when they mix in the process of scraping and blending, you'll get a color combination that's very pleasing, instead of the muddy color that results from using colors that are complementary or opposite each other on the color wheel. There's plenty more to color theory, but those are the basics for starting out. So your week 1 assignment was to take a ton of selfies, and I would love to hear how that experience went for you. Maybe it all went super smoothly, or maybe there was a particular angle that you found more challenging or uncomfortable, or maybe you found it difficult to break out of the Instagram mindset and take images that are a more direct view of yourself. In any case, I hope you'll leave me a comment and let me know your thoughts and reflections. Now I'm bringing in my selfie for this week's project, and I have printed this with my monochrome laser printer on cotton business paper, and I used 2 apps to get this effect. The first is Enlight, and in their black and white filters I used the signature filter to get a lot of contrast and a lot of texture in my selfie. And then I pulled that image into an app called Engraver, and I used the Slimline preset to get this engraved effect. This page is going to be based on phrenology charts. Phrenology was a quack science developed in the 18th and 19th centuries. The idea behind it was that aspects of a person's character and personality could be determined by the size and shape of different areas on their skull. I've always found phrenology heads and diagrams super fascinating, and I thought that it would be an interesting template for a collage that explores the inner self. So in keeping with that theme, I'm using a selfie that is in profile and that has a very antique feel to it. Hey, speaking of profiles, maybe you've seen this pop up on your Facebook feed. There's a new meme chain status thing going around where you post your first ever profile photo from Facebook and then your most recent one. And I actually think that's a pretty neat idea, but what bothers me is that it's framed in the description as a negative thing. It's called the How Hard Did Aging Hit You challenge, and I've even seen one version of it that warns you to brace yourself when you look at your selfies. Like we don't look at ourselves in the mirror every single day. And I have friends who have said really positive things about themselves and the way they look now when they did this so-called challenge. And then I have friends that won't do it at all because they find the very idea of it just so incredibly discouraging. All of which is to say that I just really wish that we didn't present aging and changing over time as something to dread. Experience leaves marks on people and changes people, and that is both natural and inevitable. We are not meant to remain perfectly preserved like organs in a jar of formaldehyde, if you'll pardon a rather gruesome analogy. Anyway, I've really enjoyed looking at my friends' comparison photos, and I was just so irritated that that was presented as something that should be a negative experience. Thank you for listening to my rant. Now back to making art. I'm bringing out some regular matte gel to use as a glue. This is just an acrylic medium, and you'll often see artists say to use fluid matte medium, but I like using the gel because for thinner pieces of paper it doesn't curl the paper, and for thicker, heavier pieces it's strong enough to actually hold it in place. A glue stick will also work just fine for all of the collaging we're going to do. And again, I am scraping that medium on using a palette knife. I'm going for a layer thick enough that it won't dry out before I get the entire area covered, but thin enough that it won't be lumpy when I press it down onto the page, so there's a little bit of finesse involved. I'm going to press it down and smooth it out and wipe up any excess that comes out under the edges very carefully. If you want to get it super extra flat and flush to that page, you can place a piece of scrap paper over it and then run a brayer over that to flatten it out. Or you can place your scrap paper and then close your book and leave it under a weight overnight. But if you're not worried about it being completely flat, you can proceed to the next step right now. We're going to do a bit of the blending that I mentioned with those foam wedges. And the goal here is to incorporate this very stark black and white selfie a little more into the colorful background and make it a part of this page. It gives it a vignette effect, which I think is a very nice combination with that signature black and white filter from the Enlight app, which has a very tintype feel to it. So just like when I did the edges of my page, I'm just lightly tapping my foam wedge over the bottom part of my image. And as I go, the paint starts to fade out from the wedge and I get a very nice gradient effect. This paint in particular thins out from an indigo to a really nice phthalo blue. So try your different craft paints and figure out what different properties they have when you get them a little bit thinner versus when they're at their full mass tone. Next, I am taking a piece of tracing paper and I'm going to trace over basically the shape of my hair, the top of my head and the back and around my ear. And I'm making this little helmet-shaped template so that I can cut my collage pieces to the correct angles and curves. Now, last week when I was talking about taking selfies, I advised you to try not to glamorize your images for these projects or to make them Instagram ready. And I've done my best to stand by that in the selfies I'm using for these projects. In fact, the filters in this case add texture instead of smoothing skin, and it's all pretty much out there. I read an amazing article a couple years ago, which I'll link in the description below, which contrasted how starkly camera angles, lenses, and body posture can change how we look in a photograph. The author is extremely body positive and emphasized how easy it is to manipulate an image even without apps or Photoshop, and more importantly, how you might end up liking the images that aren't conventionally flattering more than the ones that are. And speaking as someone who would have to use a drone to get a photo that doesn't include my double chin, I really enjoyed the way that she embraced all sides of that discussion and herself. It's a great read and I highly recommend it whether or not you already enjoy taking selfies. Earlier when we made our acrylic paint background, I encouraged you to keep your colors analogous or close to each other on the color wheel. Now that we're getting into the collage phase, I encourage you to create a triad color scheme. And a triad is usually 3 colors that are evenly spaced around the color wheel, just like the primaries, But in this case, I haven't gone quite evenly, but I have picked a mint green and a rusty orange that are very nearly complements of each other. And then of course, like I said earlier, this dark blue goes with just about everything. The idea here is to end up with 3 colors that play very well together and will create a visually striking but still cohesive whole. Now I've taken my first scrap of collage material and I'm using a plain graphite pencil to write a word on it. And I've chosen a list of words that are aspects of my character, again in keeping with that phrenology theme. So this is a page that uses a selfie, but it's about the inner self rather than the exterior image. And I used my template to trace the bottom contour. This is going to go just over the arm of my glasses up against the corner of my ear. And my first word is creation. That's something that is a compulsion for me. If I don't make something every day, my day is not complete. So it's absolutely a driving force in my life and a huge part of my personality. And even though I have scissors sitting right here, I'm going to tear all the edges for these pieces. I want it to be just a little bit raw. And because these scraps are so much smaller, I have switched to my glue stick instead of using my matte gel. But I think functionally it's basically the same substance. And because I've used graphite and I haven't sealed it in any way, it is going to smudge just a little as I press this down, and that's okay. I want that effect as well. For all of these scraps, I really want the focus to be on the words on them, so this is not an image-heavy collage. So I've chosen a lot of pieces with flat color or with abstract shapes or patterns. This one is a print I did on my gel plate. Now I'm using my template again to get a measurement of the area just in front of the scrap that I first placed. It lines up nicely with the contour in this cheesecloth that I used to make this print. I'm lightly tracing around it and giving myself a lot of space to make that tear and get some ragged edges. Think of it, if you're used to sewing, like a seam allowance. My second word is ambition, and I don't believe that any of the traits that I'm listing are inherently negative or positive. I put this list together by trying to think of what motivates me and what guides me, what has led to my successes and to my failures. All of those aspects that add up to a personality can eventually be boiled down to some pretty abstract concepts, and it's all going to be a different combination for individual people. For my third scrap, I'm getting a little fancier. I'm going to age a blank library card, the old-fashioned kind that gets stamped with the due date and then the borrower signs it. So I'm starting by adding some wrinkles to the card. And then using another foam wedge, I'm going to blend some ink onto the edges and into the center of the card to catch those wrinkles. And for me, light circular motions get just the right antique effect without putting too much ink onto the paper. This piece is going to go just behind my ear, so I'm getting my template out again to trace that shape. Now I've got some permanent black ink and my postal date stamp to put some genuine vintage dates on this library card. Only the finest antique dates. When I've got that column of dates done, I'm going to tear very carefully and try not to cut into any of them. When you start placing things, you may find that you need to adjust them or recut a particular spot, and that's always fine. That's a major reason why I recommend using scraps that you create yourself. So you haven't used an image that you only have one copy of or something like that. You can always go back and get another piece of that scrap and start over again if you need to. I have lots more library cards. I could do that aging process again if I did something that terminally messed up this one. But most issues can just be fixed by adjusting slightly or tearing a little bit more out. And try not to stress too much about making it perfect. On that note, my word for this scrap is doubt. Something else that is always with me. And I believe that skepticism is healthy and questioning things is healthy, but I do also struggle with doubting myself. I think it's probably safe to say that we all do. So I felt it important to acknowledge that on this page. Once again, I've used my tracing paper template to measure out the space where this next piece is going to fit in between the edge and my previous scraps, and I'm marking that out on a new scrap. And my word, or rather phrase, for this scrap is past mistakes, which I tend to dwell on a lot when I get really broody. It's another thing that I feel is important to acknowledge, and I hope that by giving them an official home and a location, I can kind of keep them there more. It's difficult to see over the edge of the screen, but I am tucking this one under the corner of that library card, so there's a little bit of overlap. Here's where we're at so far. Is my head half empty or half full? next word is generosity, which is definitely a guiding principle in my life. And I think it just goes to show that if you do this project long enough, you will eventually end up with the elements of harmony from My Little Pony. I'm mapping out my last two scraps now, and because I'm almost done with this piece, I'm actually going to cut my template so that I can trace it very precisely for these central pieces. Word for this scrap is urgency. I always feel like I am in a rush to complete projects, which can be great motivation, but it can also get me into trouble. I start to get down on myself when I feel like I'm not accomplishing things fast enough. And let me tell you, it doesn't mix well with perfectionism. My final word is drive, and fittingly, this piece unites all the others, and it informs everything I do creatively. There are just a few more touches to add to this page. I'm bringing out some white paint markers and a white pen. I'm using 3 different weights of these, so obviously my white pen is going to be the finest point, but I also have a fine Posca marker and a regular bullet point Posca marker, and I'm starting with that bullet point one. That's the largest of the 3. Any white paint pen is going to work just fine for this technique. It does not have to be perfectly opaque the way that the Poscas are. And this is just one more technique to unify a piece and make it pop a little bit more. I'm adding that white outline to the outside all the way around my image. Next, I'm going to repeat that with the fine point Posca pen to get a second outline, and I'm not worried about matching these up exactly. They're going to cross and overlap sometimes. I really like this effect. It almost looks like an old-fashioned light bulb filament, especially when I come back in with the white gel pen, which is just a Sakura jelly roll pen, and I start doing some very scribbly lines in random places along that outline. It looks almost like wires twisted together. And here is my finished page. I really hope you enjoyed this week's session, and your assignment for this next week is to put together a list of words that make up who you are as a person. I know that sounds a little ambitious, but give it a shot. It worked out pretty well for me. And then, using your profile selfie, fill your head with these abstract concepts. Next week, we are going to construct a layered collage using a front-facing selfie. Thanks for watching.